We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Imperial Japanese Navy has attacked Pearl Harbor.
Though the years pass quickly, the sacrifices of that generation must never be forgotten.
In January of 1972, a man named Shoichi Yokoi was found by hunters in the jungle of Guam. He was 56 years old. He had been living in a tunnel. He had dug under the roots of a bamboo grove, surviving on frogs and rats and nuts and whatever the jungle provided, emerging only at night to avoid detection. He had been in that jungle for 27 years, since the American forces had overrun Guam in 1944, and he had retreated with a handful of other soldiers deeper into the interior. His companions had died, one by one, over the years. He had been alone for the last 8 years. He knew the war was over. He had found leaflets in the jungle, dropped by aircraft, telling him the war had ended. He didn't believe them, or he believed them and couldn't reconcile them with who he was, or he had simply been in the jungle so long that returning to a world that had moved on without him had become more frightening than staying. When the hunters found him and brought him out, he said something that Japanese newspapers printed on their front pages, and that became one of the most quoted sentences of the post-war era. "It is with much embarrassment that I have returned alive." That sentence contains an entire world. It contains the Japanese military culture that had produced Yokoi, the culture that defined surrender as the ultimate disgrace, that had told a generation of young men that dying in battle was honorable and living in defeat was not, that had created conditions in which a man could spend 27 years alone in a jungle rather than face the shame of coming home. It contains a particular psychology of the holdout, the man who has been in his war so long, who has defined himself by it so completely, that the war's ending does not release him from it. And it contains something that resonates far beyond the specific story of Shoichi Yokoi, the question of what loyalty costs when the thing you are loyal to no longer exists. This episode is about the men who refused to surrender, not the soldiers who fought bravely and died, not the pilots who dove their aircraft into American ships, not the garrison commanders who chose death over capture when their positions fell. Those stories are part of the larger Pacific War, and we have touched on them in earlier episodes. This episode is specifically about the men who kept fighting after the war ended, who were in the jungles and the caves when the Emperor broadcast a surrender message on August 15th, 1945, and who did not come in. Some of them came in eventually, days or weeks after the surrender, when the reality reached them. Some of them stayed for months, some for years, some for decades. The last of them came in 1974. And understanding why, understanding what it took to keep a man fighting a war that had been over for 30 years, is one of the most revealing windows into the Japanese military culture of the Second World War that history offers. The Banzai charge is the image most associated in Western minds with the Japanese fighting spirit of the Second World War. Banzai, 10,000 years, an acclamation of the emperor, was a cry that accompanied the mass infantry charges that Japanese forces launched against American positions throughout the Pacific Campaign. These charges were militarily suicidal in almost every case. American forces with automatic weapons and artillery could cut down a massed infantry charge with reliability that made the tactic, by any rational military calculus, pointless. The men who made these charges knew this, or should have known it. They made them anyway. And the reasons they made them, the cultural and institutional and psychological forces that drove men into suicidal charges against entrenched positions, are the same forces that kept Shoichi Yokoi in his jungle tunnel for 27 years. The Japanese military of the Second World War was built on a conception of honor and duty that had its roots in the samurai tradition, but had been systematically intensified and distorted by the militarist governments that controlled Japan from the 1930s onward. The Senjinken, the field service code issued to the Japanese military in 1941, was explicit. Never lived to experience shame as a prisoner. A soldier captured by the enemy was considered to have forfeited his honor, his family's honor, and his right to be considered Japanese in any meaningful sense. He ceased to exist in the eyes of the military and in the records of his unit the moment he was taken. His family received no notification. He was simply gone, not dead, which would have been honorable, but something worse than dead, gone in a way that could not be acknowledged or mourned. This cultural framework had practical consequences that shaped the Pacific War at every level. Japanese soldiers who were surrounded and out of ammunition did not surrender. They made Banzai charges instead, choosing death in combat over the alternative that their culture told them was worse than death. Japanese sailors whose ships were sinking in the Pacific often chose to go down with them rather than be rescued, because rescue by an enemy vessel meant capture, and capture meant the death of everything that defined them. The result, from the American perspective, was a war in which the enemy would not stop fighting under conditions where any rational military calculus said stopping was the only sensible choice. I want to ask you to subscribe now if you haven't already. The stories in the series try to find the human truth inside the historical record, the specific people and the specific experiences that give the large events their meaning. If that matters to you, subscribe and share this with someone who should be watching. Back to the Pacific, back to the jungle, back to the men who stayed. The documented cases of Japanese holdouts extend well beyond Yokoi and Onoda, and the full catalog of their stories reveals a pattern that is more varied and more human than the two most famous cases alone might suggest. There were holdouts who came in quickly once they learned to surrender, men who had been genuinely out of contact, who accepted the reality of the war's end without difficulty, and who returned to civilian life with relatively little fanfare. There were holdouts who struggled with the news, but eventually came in over the weeks and months after August 1945, requiring varying degrees of persuasion, but ultimately reconciling themselves to the new reality. And there were the long-term holdouts, the men who stayed for years or decades, who represent the extreme of the pattern, but who illuminate something present, to a lesser degree, across the whole range of experience. Hiroo Onoda's initial companions on Lubang Island, Yuichi Akatsu, Shoichi Shimada, and Kinshichi Kozuka, each ended differently. Akatsu surrendered to Filipino authorities in 1950, 5 years after the war ended, having decided that the evidence of the war's conclusion was genuine. He was the first of the group to accept the new reality. Shimada was killed in a firefight with Filipino troops in 1954. Kozuka was killed in another such encounter in 1972, the same year that Yokoi was found on Guam, and 2 years before Onoda himself was finally brought in. Kozuka was 51 years old when he died. He had been in the Philippine jungle for 28 years. He died in a firefight that was, from a Filipino perspective, an encounter with an armed criminal raiding their community. From his own perspective, it was combat in a war that had never ended. The gap between these two perspectives, between the Filipino view of Kozuka as a dangerous armed man conducting criminal raids on civilian communities, and Kozuka's own view of himself as a soldier conducting military operations in a war, is one of the sharpest illustrations of what the holdout experience actually meant for communities affected by it. The holdout's loyalty was not neutral. It expressed itself in actions that had real victims. The farms that were raided were real farms. The people who were killed were real people. The decades of disruption to specific communities in Guam and the Philippines were real costs, paid by people who had no obligation to bear them. The question of how to weigh the holdout's moral responsibility for these harms is genuinely complex. They were acting in accordance with their training, their orders, and their understanding of their situation. They were not, in their own conception, criminals or terrorists. They were soldiers. But the situation their continued resistance created, the ongoing harm to civilian communities, was not one that their conception of themselves as soldiers could simply excuse. The military culture that formed them had told them that civilian harm was acceptable collateral damage in a legitimate military campaign. The campaign was not legitimate after August 1945. The harm continued regardless. The Saipan civilians who threw themselves from the cliffs at the island's northern end in June 1944, the incident mentioned in the previous episode on island hopping, represent a different dimension of the same cultural framework. These were not soldiers. They were Japanese civilians, families of settlers, some of them Okinawan or Korean, some of them Japanese, who had been brought to Saipan in the pre-war decades when the island was under Japanese administration. They had been told by Japanese propaganda that Americans were monsters who would torture, rape, and kill anyone who fell into their hands. When American forces reached the northern end of the island in the final days of the battle, hundreds of these civilians chose to die rather than be captured. American soldiers and Marines who witnessed this were genuinely horrified. They used loudspeakers. They sent Japanese-American translators to the cliff edge to call out in Japanese that the civilians would be safe, that they would not be harmed, that they should come away from a cliff. Some of the civilians listened and survived. Many did not. The combination of the propaganda they had been fed and the military culture they had absorbed, the culture that told them surrender was worse than death, was not penetrable by reassurance from the people the propaganda had demonized. The propaganda worked because it built on a foundation of genuine historical and cultural fear. Japan and the United States had been at war. American forces had been fighting Japanese forces. The specific incidents that the propaganda amplified, real incidents, in some cases, of violence against civilians in other theaters of the war, were mixed with fabrications and exaggerations to produce a picture of American behavior that the Saipan civilians had no direct experience to contradict. They died because they believed what they had been told by people with authority over their lives and their conceptions of the world. The post-war Japanese accounting of civilian deaths at Saipan and at Okinawa, where civilian casualties were vastly larger, has been a complicated and ongoing process. The official narrative of Japanese heroism and sacrifice, which served political purposes in the immediate post-war period, was challenged by historians and by the survivors and the descendants who had different stories to tell. The Okinawan experience in particular, the island whose civilian population died in the largest numbers, caught between two military forces in a battle that the island population had no say in, generated a distinctive regional history that was not fully reconciled with the mainland Japanese narrative, and that has remained a source of political tension in the decades since. The comfort women issue, the organized coercion of women, primarily from Korea and other occupied territories, into sexual slavery for the Japanese military, represents another dimension of the Japanese military culture that the holdout stories sit within. The same institutional framework that produced men willing to die rather than surrender also produced men willing to participate in the systematic violation of women who have been defined by the military as available for use. The two phenomena are not directly connected in the individual stories of specific holdouts. There is no evidence that Yokoi or Onoda was personally involved in comfort woman operations, but they are connected at the level of the institutional culture that shaped both a military culture that had dehumanized not just the enemy but the women of the occupied territories, that created a hierarchy of value in which some lives mattered and some did not, that had trained its members to override normal human responses to suffering in service of the collective military mission. The Japanese government's ongoing struggle to come to terms with the comfort woman issue, the decades of denial, partial acknowledgement, retraction, and renewed negotiation with South Korea and other affected countries, is one of the threads of the larger story about what is meant for Japan to reckon with the military culture of the wartime period. The holdouts are another thread in the same cloth. The Banzai charges are another. The Saipan cliff deaths are another. They are all expressions of the same underlying culture, a culture that produced extraordinary loyalty and extraordinary violence, extraordinary discipline and extraordinary atrocity, extraordinary courage and extraordinary cruelty, often in the same people at the same time. Understanding this is not the same as excusing it. The point of examining the Japanese military culture of the Second World War is not to generate sympathy for the perpetrators of the crimes it enabled. It is to understand how a culture produced what it produced, how the specific historical, political, and institutional forces that shaped Japan in the 1930s and 1940s created the conditions in which the things that happened could happen. Understanding is a prerequisite for the kind of reckoning that prevents repetition, and the reckoning is still ongoing. The Japanese veterans of the Second World War, the men who fought in the Pacific and in China and in Southeast Asia, and who came home, most of them in 1945 and 1946, carried their own complex relationship to what they had done and what had been done around them. The silence that many of them maintained about their wartime experience was not simply the stoic silence of men who didn't talk about hard things. It was, in many cases, the silence of men who had seen things that they could not integrate into the civilian identity they were trying to construct, or things they had done that they could not acknowledge in the post-war world without consequences they weren't prepared to face, or simply the silence of men who had been told by the post-war culture that moving on was the right thing to do. The Japanese post-war recovery The economic miracle that transformed Japan from a defeated, bombed-out, occupied country into one of the world's great industrial economies within a generation was built in part on a kind of collective amnesia about the specifics of what had been done in Japan's name during the war. The amnesia was not total, and it was contested by Japanese historians and activists who worked to bring the full record into the public discussion. But it was pervasive enough to shape the public culture for decades, and its effects are still visible in the political tensions over historical textbooks and war memorials and the Yasukuni Shrine, and all the other sites where the past and the present collide in Japanese public life. The holdouts, in this sense, were not simply extreme cases of military loyalty. They were extreme cases of a broader Japanese experience. The experience of men whose identity had been formed around a mission and a culture that the war's end had declared finished, who were trying to figure out how to live in a world that had moved on from what they were. Most Japanese veterans face this challenge in the civilian context, returning to peacetime life and constructing new identities around family and work and the post-war recovery. The holdouts face in the jungle, and their response, stay in the jungle, maintain the mission, refuse a new reality, was the most extreme possible version of a challenge that all the war survivors faced in some form. That is what makes them more than curiosities. That is why their stories have continued to resonate in Japan and beyond for decades after the last of them came home. They are not simply interesting historical footnotes. They are mirrors, extreme, distorted, illuminating mirrors, that show us something true about what war does to the people it shapes, and what it costs when the war is over and the people it shaped are still here. The broader context of Japanese military culture from which the holdouts emerged requires some examination, because it is not possible to understand the holdouts without understanding the system that produced them. The Japanese military of the 1930s and 1940s was not simply an army and a navy. It was a total institution in the sociological sense, an organization that consumed the whole identity of its members, that claimed not just their professional service, but their fundamental conception of themselves and their place in the world. The process by which young Japanese men were transformed into soldiers willing to die rather than surrender began long before military service itself. The Japanese educational system of the pre-war decades was a systematic instrument of national and imperial indoctrination, producing graduates who had internalized the values of loyalty, sacrifice, and imperial devotion as the core of their identity. The specific military training that followed built on this foundation, hardening it, intensifying it, stripping away the individual self that might resist the demands of collective sacrifice and replace it with military identity defined by absolute obedience and absolute commitment. The physical brutality of Japanese military training was itself an instrument of this transformation. The beatings that were routine in Japanese military units, officers beating enlisted men, senior enlisted beating junior enlisted, were not simply sadism, though sadism was certainly present. They were a method of conditioning, a systematic demonstration that the individual body and the individual were subordinate to military hierarchy, that pain was to be endured rather than avoided, that the self had no claims that outweighed the demands of the institution. Men who survived this conditioning were men who had been trained at a deep level to override the survival instinct in service of a larger obligation. The kamikaze program, the organized use of aircraft as guided missiles, with the pilot's death built into the design of the mission, was the most extreme institutional expression of this culture. The kamikaze pilots who volunteered for these missions, and the official narrative was that they were volunteers, though the social pressure that produced the volunteering was not distinguishable from coercion in many cases, were young men, many of them students, who had internalized the culture's message that dying for the emperor was the highest possible form of life. They wrote farewell letters to their families. They participated in ritual ceremonies before their final flights. They were not, in the main, men who were indifferent to their own deaths. They were men who had been taught that their deaths had a value that their lives could not match, and who acted on that teaching. The suicide weapons that the Japanese military developed in the final stages of the war, not just a kamikaze aircraft, but the Kaiten human torpedo, the Shinyo explosive motorboat, the Fukuria frogman with mine on a pole, represent a military innovation that has no parallel in any other combatant nation's arsenal. The American and British and German and Soviet militaries asked their personnel to risk death in battle. The Japanese military designed weapons that required death as a feature rather than a risk. The men who operated these weapons were not risking their lives. They were committing them. The distinction matters for understanding what the Japanese military had become by 1944 and 1945, and what would have asked of its people in the defense of the home islands. The planned defense of the Japanese home islands. The operations that were being prepared as the Allied forces approached from the Pacific and from the mainland of Asia reflected the same logic at the largest possible scale. Operation Ketsugo, the Japanese plan for the defense of Kyushu against the expected American invasion, called for approximately 10,000 kamikaze aircraft, several thousand suicide boats, and ground forces that would be supplemented by the civilian population, women, children, old men, armed with bamboo spears and instructed to die fighting rather than surrender. The Japanese government had begun distributing weapons to civilians and conducting military training for the entire population. The expected casualties in defense of the home islands, based on the rates established at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, ran into the millions on both sides. It was into this context that the atomic bombs fell. The decision to use them, made by President Truman and his advisors in July and August 1945, has been debated by historians and ethicists ever since, and the debate will not be resolved here. What is relevant to the story of the holdouts and the last Banzai is the effect the bombs had on the Japanese decision to surrender. The Emperor's decision to accept the Allied terms and broadcast a surrender message on August 15th. 1945 was not primarily the product of the atomic bombs alone. The Soviet declaration of war against Japan on August 8th, which ended any hope of Soviet mediation that Japanese strategists had been counting on, was equally significant. But the bombs provided a framework within which Japanese leaders who wanted to end the war could argue for surrender without attributing it to conventional military defeat. The damage had been done by a new kind of weapon, a weapon that made the continuation of resistance objectively impossible rather than merely costly. The Emperor's broadcast on August 15th was the first time most Japanese citizens had heard his voice. He did not use the word surrender. He spoke in formal classical Japanese that many of his listeners could not fully parse. He said that the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, and that Japan was prepared to accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. He asked his subjects to endure the unendurable and to bear the unbearable, and he asked his military forces to lay down their arms. Most of them did. The organized demobilization of the Japanese military, which still had millions of men under arms in China, in Southeast Asia, in the Pacific Island garrisons, and in the home islands, was conducted over the following weeks and months with speed and a degree of compliance that surprised many Allied observers. The military culture that had been so resistant to surrender in combat proved, when the Emperor himself commanded it, capable of organized submission. The authority of the imperial institution that had demanded sacrifice proved sufficient, in the end, to demand its opposite, but not everywhere. Not for everyone. In the jungles of Guam and Lubang and the other islands where isolated soldiers had lost contact with their units and their command structure, the Emperor's voice did not reach, or reached and was not believed, or reached and was believed but could not be reconciled with the identity that decades of conditioning had built. The soldiers who came involuntarily in the weeks and months after surrender, and there were many of them, holdouts who had been surviving in jungles and caves and had simply been out of contact when the surrender occurred, came into a world that received them with the complex mixture of welcome and uncertainty that any returning prisoner of war might expect. Some were treated as heroes. Some were treated as curiosities. Some were treated with the wariness that communities have toward people who have been outside the normal social order for a long time and whose reintegration requires a kind of negotiation on both sides. The men who stayed, who were still in the jungle in 1946, 1947, 1948, as Japan's post-war recovery began and the country started to rebuild, were making a choice, however unconscious, to remain outside the new Japan that was taking shape around them. For some of them, the choice was driven by genuine military conviction. They believed the war continued. For some, it was driven by the anticipation of punishment for actions they had taken during the war. For some, it was simply the absence of any framework for what coming in would mean. The Filipino communities on the islands where the holdouts operated paid a continuing price for the ongoing resistance. The farms that were raided, the people who were killed or threatened, the economic disruption of having an armed and hostile presence in the jungle. These costs were borne by people who had no part in the decision that had left Japanese soldiers on their islands in 1944. The holdouts' loyalty was to Japan and to the emperor. It expressed itself partly at the expense of Filipino civilians who were simply in the way. The historical treatment of the holdouts in Japan has evolved over the decades since the war ended. The initial reception, the honor given to Yokoi and Onoda as exemplars of loyalty and determination, has given way, in the Japanese historical consciousness, to a more complex assessment that acknowledges the human tragedy of their decades in the jungle alongside the military culture that produced it. The post-war Japan that was built on pacifism and economic development rather than military conquest had to find a way to honor the loyalty these men represented without endorsing the system that had demanded it. The accommodation was never entirely comfortable, and it was never entirely resolved. The Senjinken, the field service code that had told these men never to live in shame as a prisoner, was officially abolished as part of the post-war demilitarization of Japan. The military culture it embodied did not disappear overnight. Its echoes were present in the reception of Yokoi and Onoda, in the respectful coverage of their stories, in the national pride that many Japanese felt in men who had demonstrated the loyalty and endurance that the culture valued. The holdouts were, in this sense, a kind of mirror, reflecting back to post-war Japan an image of what the old Japan had been, and inviting a reckoning with what that image meant. Hiroo Onoda, in the years after his return, became a figure who occupied a unique space in Japanese culture, a man whom people admired and whom they also, quietly, felt sorry for. He had given 30 years of his life to a mission that had ceased to be real the moment the emperor surrendered. He had done it with a dedication and a capability that were genuinely extraordinary. And he had come home to a country that was no longer the country he had fought for, to a world that had moved on to things he had not been part of, carrying a loyalty that the object of his loyalty had not reciprocated in the years he was in the jungle. He settled eventually in Japan, ran a nature school for young people, wrote books, gave lectures, and became a public figure associated with outdoor survival skills and the values of discipline and endurance. He did not, in his public statements, express regret for the 30 years he had spent in the jungle. He said he had done his duty. He had followed his orders. He had done what a soldier was supposed to do. From within the framework of the military culture that had formed him, he was right. The framework itself, the culture that had made those 30 years seem like the right response to the situation, is what the history must finally reckon with. That is the story of the last Banzai. Not the charge, not the dramatic, suicidal, militarily futile assault that the word summons, but the quieter, longer, stranger thing. The men who kept going after the war was over, who held the line of military identity long after the military context that gave it meaning had dissolved, who were loyal to something that no longer existed and paid a price in years and in lives, and in the specific human cost of an existence spent in isolation and resistance, and the absence of anything that was. Not the mission. They were, in their own way, the last soldiers of a war that the world had moved on from. They came home eventually, most of them. They said what they had to say. They lived the rest of their lives in the country they had stayed faithful to. And the country they came back to was trying, in its own complicated way, to be worthy of what they had sacrificed, while also trying to understand how the thing that had produced them could be mourned and learned from and not simply repeated. That reckoning is still underway. The most famous of the holdouts, the man whose story has become the defining narrative of the Japanese soldier who refused to surrender, was Hiroo Onoda. Onoda was a junior officer, trained in intelligence and guerrilla warfare, who was assigned to the island of Lubang in the Philippines in December 1944 with orders to conduct guerrilla operations and never surrender. His commanding officer's final instruction was explicit. Whatever happens, we will come back for you. His orders were to hold out until then. He held out until 1974. The story of Onoda's 30 years in the Philippine jungle is extraordinary in almost every particular. He was not, like Yokoi, a man who had lost contact with reality or who had descended into isolation and survival mode. He was a trained intelligence officer conducting a deliberate military operation according to the orders he had been given, with a clarity of purpose and a discipline of method that he maintained for 3 decades. He had companions at various points. 3 other soldiers initially, reduced by attrition over the years until he was alone in the early 1970s. He raided local farms for food. He maintained his weapons and his equipment. He studied intelligence materials when he could obtain them, and constructed his own interpretation of events that allowed him to dismiss the evidence that the war had ended. The evidence was abundant. Leaflets were dropped from aircraft. Newspapers were left in the jungle. His family sent personal appeals. Japanese government officials came to the island and called for him through loudspeakers. He dismissed all of it as enemy propaganda. The war could not be over because he had not been relieved of his orders. His commanding officer had said they would come back for him. He was waiting for them to come back. What finally brought Onoda on was the arrival, in 1974, of a young Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki, who had come to the Philippines specifically to find Onoda, reportedly as part of a personal quest to encounter a Japanese soldier still fighting the war, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. Suzuki found Onoda in the jungle, made contact, and persuaded him that the war was real, or at least that Suzuki himself was real, and that the world had changed. But Onoda would not come in without being formally relieved of his orders. He was still a soldier, still bound by the command structure that had placed him on Lubang in 1944. Without a formal order from a superior officer, he had no authority to stop. The Japanese government located Onoda's former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, who had become a bookseller in Japan. Taniguchi flew to the Philippines, entered the jungle, found Onoda, and formally relieved him of his orders. Onoda's response, the response of a professional soldier to a formal military order after 30 years in the jungle, was to present his weapon in good working order and report that he had fulfilled his mission to the best of his ability. He had maintained his weapons and his discipline. He had not surrendered. He had done what he was told. He was 62 years old. The Japanese government and public received Onoda with a mixture of reverence and bewilderment. He was honored as a hero of extraordinary loyalty and dedication. He was also, for many Japanese, a living reminder of a past that the country had been trying to leave behind, a ghost in the wartime culture that had led Japan into a catastrophic war, and that the post-war decades had worked, with varying success, to transform. Onoda himself was not entirely comfortable in the Japan he returned to. He eventually emigrated to Brazil, where he ran a cattle ranch, before returning to Japan in his later years. He died in 2014 at the age of 91. The question of what to make of Hiroo Onoda is not simple. He was, by every measure, a man of extraordinary commitment and extraordinary capability. He survived 30 years of jungle warfare through skill and determination and discipline. He was loyal to a military and an imperial system that had committed atrocities on a scale that the post-war world rightly condemned. He spent those 30 years conducting operations against Filipino civilians, raiding farms, occasionally killing people who were attempting to end his resistance, in service of a mission that had ceased to have any legitimate military purpose the moment Japan surrendered. His loyalty was genuine, and his courage was real, and his actions caused real harm to real people who had no obligation to be in the path of a war that had ended 3 decades earlier. This complexity, the coexistence of genuine virtue and genuine harm in the same man and the same story, is part of what makes the holdout stories so revealing. They illuminate the full cost of the military culture that produced them, not just the cost of men themselves, who gave decades of their lives to a mission that was over, but the cost of the people around them who continued to be affected by a war they believed had ended. The other holdouts who have been documented, and there were many more than Yokoi and Onoda, though those two are the most famous, each represent a variation on the same fundamental pattern. The pattern is a man whose identity has been formed around military service, around loyalty to the emperor and the imperial military, around conception of honor that makes surrender unthinkable, placed in a situation where those values drive him to continue fighting after a rational basis for fighting has been removed. The specific circumstances vary. Some stayed out of genuine belief that the war continued. Some knew the war was over but couldn't face the shame of coming in. Some had done things during the war that they feared to be held accountable for. Some had simply been in the jungle so long that the jungle had become home in a way that the civilian world could not be. The Japanese prisoners who were taken in the Pacific Campaign, a much smaller proportion of Japanese forces than the prisoners to combatants ratio, in the European theater provide a different window into the same cultural framework. Many of the Japanese soldiers who were captured had been rendered unconscious or incapacitated before capture. They were not men who chose to be taken prisoner, but men who were taken in circumstances where they had no choice. Their experience of capture was, in many cases, the expected shame of having failed in the fundamental obligation of their military service. Some of them cooperated extensively with American intelligence, providing information, participating in psychological warfare operations aimed at convincing other Japanese soldiers to surrender, apparently experiencing the cooperation as a form of making use of the only option remaining to them. The American military's attempts to encourage Japanese surrender throughout the Pacific Campaign were, by the standards of conventional military psychology, remarkably ineffective. Leaflets were dropped. Loudspeaker appeals were made. Japanese prisoners were sometimes sent to appeal to their comrades. The results were modest at best. The cultural framework that defined surrender as death or worse than death was not significantly penetrable by appeals to self-interest or rational calculation, because the military culture that had shaped these men had specifically trained them to override self-interest and rational calculation in service of a different set of values. The Banzai charge represents the extreme expression of this framework, the moment when a Japanese military unit, its position untenable, its ammunition exhausted or nearly so, chose mass death in a final charge over the alternative of surrender or organized retreat. These charges were made throughout the Pacific Campaign, from Guadalcanal to Tarawa, to Saipan to Okinawa. They were tactically disastrous for the Japanese forces that made them and correspondingly costly for the American forces that had to stop them. Not in casualties, necessarily, since the automatic weapons of American offensive positions could cut down a mass charge with devastating efficiency, but in the psychological impact of watching men die in this way, and in the specific incidents where the charges came at night or in conditions of poor visibility and achieved local surprise. The last Banzai charge of the Pacific War was arguably not made by a Japanese military unit at all. It was made, in a sense, by every Japanese soldier who remained in the jungle after August 1945 and continued to resist. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in a sustained, individual, daily choice to remain committed to a mission that the world around them had abandoned. Each day in the jungle was its own small Banzai, its own refusal of the alternative, its own maintenance of the only identity that remained available. Shoichi Yokoi came home from Guam in 1972 and said he was embarrassed to have returned alive. Hiroo Onoda came home from the Philippines in 1974 and presented his weapon in working order, his mission complete. Both of them were received in Japan with a complex mixture of honor and grief. Honor for the loyalty they had demonstrated, grief for the decades of their lives they had spent in the jungle, grief for what the culture that had sent them there had cost Japan and the world. Both of them lived into old age in the country they had kept faith with for so long. Yokoi died in 1997. Onoda in 2014. There is a dimension of the holdout stories that becomes visible only when you look at them from the perspective of the families the holdouts left behind in Japan. Shoichi Yokoi's family had received no word from him after the American capture of Guam in 1944. In the post-war years, as the Japanese government processed the record of men who had died in the Pacific and notified their families, Yokoi's family received no notification of death, because Yokoi had not died, but they also received no word that he was alive. He was simply absent. The family managed, as families do, making lives around the absence, constructing a story that could hold the uncertainty without being destroyed by it. When Yokoi was found in 1972 and his identity was confirmed and the news reached Japan, his family was confronted with the return of someone they had believed dead for nearly 3 decades. The reunion was real and it was joyful in certain ways. It was also the reunion of people who had lived entirely separate lives and who had very little actual shared experience to draw on. Yokoi had not been present for anything that had happened in his family's lives since 1944. He did not know his relatives' children, did not know the details of anyone's life, did not share the accumulated experience of 3 decades of post-war Japan. He was, in the most practical sense, a stranger who shared a blood relationship with people he'd been absent from for most of their adult lives. The reintegration of the holdouts into Japanese society was, in almost every case, imperfect. Yokoi married in 1972, the year of his return, a woman he had met after coming home. He became a public figure, appeared on television, made statements about the war and his experience that were received with a complex mixture of honor and bewilderment that characterized Japanese public culture's response to his return. He seemed, by most accounts, to make a reasonable adjustment to civilian life, though the specifics of what that adjustment cost him internally were not available to anyone outside his immediate circle. Onoda's reintegration was in some ways more difficult. He was 62 when he came home, older than Yokoi had been, and the 30 years he had spent in the jungle had been more deliberately maintained as a military mission rather than a survival exercise. He was not a man who had been hiding in a tunnel. He was a man who had been conducting operations. The transition from operational military intelligence officer to civilian in a pacifist democracy was a more jarring one, and it showed in the years after his return. His eventual emigration to Brazil, where he ran a cattle ranch for several years before returning to Japan, was, by his own account, partly a response to the difficulty of finding a place in Japan he had come home to. The nature schools that Onoda eventually ran in Japan, teaching young people outdoor survival skills, the discipline and the self-reliance that he had maintained in the jungle, were a practical expression of his attempt to find a place in the new Japan for the values he had spent 30 years embodying. The skills he taught were genuine and valuable. The framework he taught them within, the emphasis on discipline, on endurance, on the subordination of individual comfort to collective purpose, was also genuine, though it sat uneasily in the context of a post-war Japan that was trying to build a different kind of society on different kinds of values. The other less famous holdouts, the men who came in during the late 1940s and 1950s and 1960s, some of whom left very little public record, represent a population whose experiences have been less extensively documented, but whose numbers were significant. By some estimates, several thousand Japanese soldiers remain at large in the Pacific Island territories and in the Philippines and in Southeast Asia in the months and years after the surrender. Most of them came in relatively quickly once the reality of the surrender was established, within months or at most a year or two. A smaller number stayed longer. And the smallest number, the handful who stayed for decades, are the ones whose stories have entered the permanent historical record. The Philippine government's response to the continuing presence of Japanese holdouts on its territory evolved over the post-war decades from military pursuit, the operations that killed Shimada in 1954 and Kozuka in 1972, to a more complex approach that tried to balance the security interests of Filipino communities with the recognition that the holdouts were, in some sense, victims of the military culture that had produced them. By the time Onoda came in 1974, the Philippine government's response was more ceremony than confrontation. The stage relief of his orders by his former commanding officer, the formal military courtesies, the acknowledgement that what was happening was the end of something that had gone on long past its proper conclusion. The American military's role in the Pacific Island holdout phenomenon was primarily logistical, providing transportation for Japanese repatriation missions, supporting the search operations, facilitating the distribution of leaflets and the broadcast of surrender appeals. The Americans who had fought the Pacific War and who served in the occupation of Japan had their own complex relationship to the holdout stories, which were simultaneously evidence of the Japanese fighting spirit that had made the Pacific War so costly and evidence of the human damage that the military culture had done to the men it shaped. The holdouts were, from the American perspective, a curiosity and a reminder that wars end on paper before they end in the minds of the people who fought them. The last confirmed holdout, the last Japanese soldier to formally surrender, was Taro Nakamura, an indigenous Taiwanese soldier who had been conscripted into the Japanese military and who was found on the Indonesian island of Morotai in December 1974, a month after Onoda's emergence in the Philippines. Nakamura's story added another layer of complexity to the holdout phenomenon. He was not ethnically Japanese, not a product of the specifically Japanese military culture that had shaped Yokoi and Onoda, but a conscripted soldier from a colonized people who had served in Japan's military and had continued, through whatever combination of loyalty and fear and habit and isolation, to maintain his position in the jungle for nearly 30 years. Nakamura's reintegration into civilian life was more complicated than Yokoi's or Onoda's, partly because Taiwan's political status had changed during the decades he was in the jungle. Taiwan was no longer part of Japan. and his relationship to either Japan or Taiwan was ambiguous in ways that the official repatriation process struggled to accommodate. He was eventually repatriated to Taiwan, where he lived until his death in 1979. He received relatively little public attention compared to Yokoi and Onoda, partly because his story was less compatible with the narrative of Japanese military loyalty that the public culture had built around the earlier holdouts. The holdout phenomenon was not exclusively Japanese. German soldiers were found in remote areas of Eastern Europe years after the war ended. Men who had been cut off, who had been living with local populations, who had been afraid to come in, or who had simply lost contact with the reality that the war had ended. The Soviet Gulag contained men who had been German prisoners and who were not released until years after the formal end of hostilities. The specific form that the Japanese holdout phenomenon took, the jungle survival, the continued guerrilla operations, the decades of isolation, was shaped by the specific geography of the Pacific Theater and the specific culture of the Japanese military. But the underlying human experience of men whose war continued inside themselves after it ended in the world was not uniquely Japanese. What was distinctive about the Japanese holdouts was the institutional framework that sustained their continued resistance, the military culture, the orders that had been given, the conception of honor that defined surrender as worse than death. These were not men who had simply lost contact with the surrender. Some of them, Onoda most clearly, knew the war was over and continued anyway, because their conception of their duty and their identity did not allow them to accept the war's ending without explicit release from their obligations. The institution that had created those obligations had dissolved, but the obligations themselves, internalized over years of military conditioning, remained. That is the deepest lesson of the last Banzai. Not the courage, though the courage was real. Not the loyalty, though the loyalty was extraordinary. The lesson is about what institutions do to the people they shape, how deeply the values and the identity of an institution can be internalized, how long they can persist after the institution is gone, and at what cost to people who carry them and to the people around them. The Japanese holdouts paid that cost in years. The Filipino and Guamanian communities affected by their continued operations paid it in security and disruption. The families left behind in Japan paid it in absence and uncertainty, and the strange reunion with people who were both familiar and entirely unknown. The last Banzai was not a charge. It was a choice, made over and over again, to remain committed to something that no longer existed. It lasted 30 years. It cost what it cost. And it ended, finally, when the last soldier laid down his weapon and came in from the jungle to a world that had been waiting, in its complicated way, for him to come home. The Japan they came back to was not the Japan that had sent them to their islands in 1944. It was a country that had undergone one of the most profound transformations in the history of any nation, from a military empire built on an ideology of racial superiority and divine imperial authority to a constitutional democracy with a pacifist constitution, and a post-war prosperity built on manufacturing and trade rather than conquest. The transformation was real and it was deep, though it was also incomplete and contested in ways that the official post-war narrative sometimes obscured. The men who came back from the jungle were artifacts of the old Japan, living connections to a past that the new Japan was still working out its relationship to. Their stories are not, in the end, stories about military fanaticism, though military culture is central to them. They are stories about identity, about what happens when the thing that defines you is taken away, when the context that gave your life its meaning ceases to exist, when the mission that justified everything is declared finished by people who have the authority to do so, but whose authority you have no framework for accepting. The holdouts stayed in the jungle because coming out meant accepting that who they were was no longer valid, that the values they had organized their lives around had been defeated, that the world had moved on to something they had not been part of and could not fully join. That is a human condition that extends far beyond the specific history of the Japanese holdouts of the Second World War. The form it took in the Pacific jungles was extreme and historically specific, but the underlying experience of a person whose identity is bound to something that ends and who cannot easily construct a different identity when that thing is gone is recognizable across many contexts and many lives. The holdouts were not incomprehensible. They were, in their own way, entirely human. That is what makes their stories worth telling. The international legal framework that applied to the holdouts, or failed to apply to them, is worth a brief examination because it illuminates a gap between the categories that law provides and the reality that the holdouts represented. Under the laws of war as they existed in 1945, a soldier who continued to fight after a formal surrender had been announced was no longer a combatant entitled to prisoner of war status. He was, technically, an outlaw, someone operating outside the framework of armed conflict that international law recognized. The practical implications of this legal status were limited, because the holdouts were not in a jurisdiction where any legal process was readily applicable to them. But it meant that the Filipino and Guamanian communities affected by their operations had limited legal recourse against people who were causing them genuine harm. They could report incidents to local authorities. The authorities could attempt to apprehend the holdouts at the risk of armed confrontation. And when confrontation occurred and holdouts were killed, as Shimada and Kozuka were killed, the legal and moral accounting was murky in ways that left everyone involved with more questions and answers. The Japanese government's role in the holdout problem was similarly complicated. Officially, the Japanese government had surrendered unconditionally and had an obligation to ensure that its soldiers complied with the surrender. In practice, the government had limited ability to reach soldiers in remote jungles in foreign countries, and the political context of the occupation years made assertive Japanese government action in this area difficult. The repatriation missions that the government organized, the flights of former officers to various Pacific islands to announce a surrender and appeal to holdouts, were genuine efforts, but their effectiveness was limited by the same factors that limited everything else. The holdouts had to be found, and they had to believe what they were told, and both of those requirements were difficult to satisfy in the specific circumstances. The veterans organizations and the families of missing soldiers in Japan were persistent advocates for continued search and repatriation efforts. For families who did not know whether their missing relative was dead or alive in the jungle somewhere, the holdout phenomenon created a particular kind of unresolved grief. The grief of not knowing, of living with the possibility that the person you thought was dead might be alive somewhere, that the ending you had constructed for yourself might need to be revised. When Yokoi was found in 1972, it reopened for other families the question of whether their missing relatives might still be out there. In some cases, they were right to ask. But the uncertainty was real, and the families who carried it deserved better than the decades of official silence they often received. The psychological literature on prisoners of war provides some useful frameworks for understanding the holdout experience, even though the holdouts were not prisoners in conventional sense. The research on what extended captivity does to human psychology, how it distorts time perception, narrows meaningful experience, creates attachment to the routines and the identity that survived, is relevant to men who had been in the jungle for decades. The holdouts had chosen their confinement and maintained it actively, but the psychological effects of decades of extreme isolation and sustained stress were comparable in important ways to the effects of captivity on men who had not chosen their confinement. The fact that Onoda maintained his operational effectiveness over 30 years, that his weapon was in working order, his discipline intact, his operations deliberate rather than merely reactive, suggests something important about the relationship between mission and psychological survival in extreme situations. Having a purpose, having an identity organized around clear objectives, is psychologically sustaining in ways that mere survival is not. The mission kept Onoda functional. It also kept him in the jungle long after the mission had ceased to have legitimate meaning. The same thing that sustained him was the thing that kept him in the jungle